The reading of my father's will lasted 17 minutes, just long enough for Gregory and Samuel to split $18 million between them. All I got was a dusty envelope so worthless they laughed in my face, but inside it was a truth that would bring them to their knees. My name is Preston Thorne, and this is how an empire collapsed in one night. I was 29 when the call came. They told me my father, Charles Reed, was found at his office desk on the 43rd floor of Reed Holdings in New York, slumped over a stack of contracts with a pen still in his hand. The man who had built an empire of steel and glass towers was gone at 68. And yet the first thing that filled the air in our family was not grief, but the echo of doors opening to inheritance. I drove back from Denver that evening, a long stretch of highway carrying me from the life I had carved on my own to the mansion in Westchester where I had always been a guest in my own home. I remember parking my battered Ford outside the gates and watching a line of black town cars already parked neatly on the circular driveway. Inside lights spilled across the marble steps, golden chandeliers glared against the night. My brothers were already there drinking scotch from our father's collection like it was a toast to their own future. Gregory was 37, always the heir apparent, the man father paraded in business meetings as the perfect successor. He wore his navy suit like armor, a Rolex glinting on his wrist that he must have taken straight off our father's body. Samuel was 34, looser in posture, tie undone but just as smug. He had made a career out of fast investments and faster parties, always cushioned by father's money. They looked at me when I entered not as a grieving son, but as a stranger stepping over a line they had drawn years ago. Gregory raised his glass without rising from the leather armchair. "Nathan, look who decided to show up. The dutiful son from Denver." Samuel smirked, swirling the amber in his glass. "Thought you might skip it. Funerals and family never seemed your thing." I wanted to tell them funerals had never been father's thing either, that the man had lived more with balance sheets than with people, but I kept silent. My Aunt Margaret moved toward me and hugged me briefly, her hands cold, her eyes soft. At least one person still saw me as family. The dining room smelled of roasted meat and expensive cigars. Portraits of Reed men hung along the walls, stern faces in oil paint staring down at me. I had grown up under those gazes, always feeling like an intruder. Tonight was no different. I sat at the edge of the long table, far from the laughter that erupted between my brothers and their wives. Victoria whispered into Gregory's ear, both of them smiling as if the future had already been delivered in a silver tray. Claire leaned against Samuel, her diamonds sparkling under the chandelier. I ate nothing. My fork scraped once against the china, and the sound seemed louder than their laughter. My mind kept circling back to my father's last moments. Did he feel it, that tightening in his chest, the weight crushing his ribs? Did he realize he was leaving everything behind and still signing papers until his last breath? Margaret glanced down the table at me, her lips moving silently. "Are you all right?" I nodded, though the truth was far from it. I excused myself and walked into the hallway lined with marble columns. The air there was cooler, less suffocating. My footsteps echoed, and suddenly I was 8 years old again, summoned to dinner and shown exactly where I belonged. Father sat at the head, Gregory and Samuel beside him, their chairs high-backed and carved with initials. Mine was at the far end, close to the swinging door where the staff moved in and out. No initials, no family crest, just a chair that could be pulled out for any guest. I remembered one night Gregory bragging about his grades at Princeton. Samuel talking about the markets he barely understood. Father listened, nodding, correcting his voice warm. When he turned to me, it was only to ask if I needed anything for school. I said no, sir, even when my shoes had holes and my notebooks were nearly full. His nod was the end of it, and I was dismissed even as I sat there. Standing in that hallway now, hearing muffled laughter from the dining room, the memory clamped down hard. I pressed my hands into my pockets, fighting the urge to walk back out the door and never return. But something held me there, something heavier than resentment. It was the knowledge that tomorrow we would gather again, not for mourning, but for the reading of a will that would measure each of us in numbers. I looked up at the portrait of my grandfather, the first Reed to step into New York real estate. Painted with steel eyes and a jaw like iron. The weight of that name had been a shadow over me since the day I was born. I was Nathaniel Reed by blood, but never by worth in their eyes. And tomorrow, when papers were read aloud, that judgment would be carved even deeper. I walked back into the dining room quietly. Gregory was laughing loudly, Samuel leaning back with his glass. No one noticed me slip past them. I climbed the staircase to the guest room that had always been mine, not a son's room, but a space for someone temporary. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the suitcase I had carried from Denver. The house was alive with voices below, but up here it was silence and the thrum of my own heart. My father was dead, my brothers were already celebrating, and I was left with the same question I had carried my whole life. What place did I truly have in the Reed family? I lay back against the mattress and closed my eyes, the glow of the chandelier seeping through the crack of the door. Tomorrow would bring answers, perhaps more ridicule, perhaps something else. Tonight there was only the echo of my father's voice from years past, asking if I needed anything, and my own voice, small and obedient, whispering, "No, sir." The morning air was sharp when I stepped into the library where the will was to be read. Heavy curtains kept the sunlight dim, and the polished oak walls carried the scent of old cigars and leather. The room was already filled. Gregory sat near the fireplace, his navy suit pressed, his tie knotted perfectly. Samuel lounged in the chair opposite, legs crossed, his smile lazy but triumphant. Their wives were beside them, Victoria with her tablet in hand, as if she were already shopping, Claire adjusting her diamond earrings every few minutes so they caught the light. Aunt Margaret sat quietly in the corner, her hands folded in her lap, watching me with worried eyes. Arthur Blake, the family's attorney for decades, stood behind the massive desk where our father had signed countless contracts. He was tall, lean, with silver hair combed straight back and glasses perched on his nose. He tapped a stack of papers against the desk to square them before speaking. His voice filled the room, measured and steady, carrying the weight of the law more than the warmth of condolence. He began with formalities, the recognition of Charles Reed's passing, the acknowledgement that the will was executed in accordance with state law, witnessed and notarized. My brothers barely contained their impatience. Gregory cleared his throat every few minutes. Samuel spun his glass of water in circles, the ice clinking. Arthur adjusted his glasses and began. To my eldest son, Gregory Reed, I leave the Reed Plaza properties in Manhattan, including the office towers on Madison Avenue and the residential complex near Central Park. Current estimated value just under $10 million. Gregory leaned back, lips pressing into a smug line as Victoria reached for his hand. Arthur continued. To my second son, Samuel Reed, I leave the Reed estate in the Hamptons along with the family's vintage automobile collection and the yacht currently moored in Sag Harbor. Total estimated value $8 million. Samuel chuckled under his breath, Claire squeezing his arm in delight. The sound of their laughter tightened my chest. The numbers rolled off Arthur's tongue like they were nothing more than chess pieces moved across a board. 10 million. 8 million. Assets carved up as if they had already belonged to my brothers before this moment. Then Arthur paused, his eyes shifting toward me. His hand moved to a separate folder, thinner, older edges worn. He cleared his throat and read, "To my youngest son, Nathaniel Reed, I leave the enclosed envelope sealed by my hand, to be opened only by him." A silence fell heavy and cruel. Arthur reached into the folder and placed a small, dust-coated envelope on the desk. It looked out of place among the thick legal documents, fragile and unassuming. My name was written across it in my father's hand. The ink faint, the strokes uneven. Gregory laughed first, a sharp burst that echoed against the oak panels. Samuel joined in, shaking his head. "This is rich," Gregory said, his voice dripping with amusement. 10 million for me, 8 for Sam, and our little brother gets a letter." Samuel smirked, leaning forward. "Maybe it is a coupon for new shoes, Nate. Heard yours are still worn thin." Their laughter filled the room. Victoria and Claire giggled, their eyes sliding toward me with pity disguised as superiority. I sat still, my palms pressed against my knees, forcing myself not to react. Arthur's voice cut through. "That concludes the reading of the will." Gregory stood, adjusting his cufflinks. "Efficient as always, Arthur. Father knew who carried the weight of the family." Samuel rose too, his grin wide. "Guess this means drinks are on us tonight." They walked past me as if I were invisible, their perfume and cologne lingering in the air like arrogance. Victoria whispered something into Gregory's ear that made him chuckle louder. Claire brushed past her diamonds, catching the dim light. I reached forward slowly and picked up the envelope. It was lighter than I expected, almost fragile, the paper rough beneath my fingers. On the front, below my name, was a line written in shaky script. "Blood decides lineage, character decides worth. You will know when you open this." My throat tightened. For a moment I wondered if the man who had barely looked at me my whole life had found the courage to say something more in death. Aunt Margaret rose from her chair and came to me. Her hand rested on my shoulder. "Whatever it is, Nathan, it is yours alone. Do not let them take it from you." I nodded, unable to speak. Gregory's laughter carried from the hallway Samuel's voice, boasting about summer parties in the Hamptons. Their joy rattled in my chest like stones. I slid the envelope into my jacket pocket. The dust clung to my fingertips, and I could not shake the feeling that whatever waited inside was heavier than any tower of glass or estate by the sea. Arthur gathered his papers, offering me a small nod, almost sympathetic. "Nathan, your father was a complicated man, remember that." The room emptied quickly after that, leaving behind the scent of cigars and the echo of mocking laughter. I stood alone by the desk, the envelope pressing against my chest with every breath, wondering why it felt more like a burden than an inheritance. I stepped into the hallway, the portraits of stern Reed men staring down at me. Gregory's voice drifted back from the front doors, bragging to Samuel. 18 million split between us, and poor Nate with his dusty envelope. Some legacy. Their laughter faded as the doors shut behind them. I stayed where I was, hand resting against the pocket that held the envelope. For the first time in years, I felt the stir of something sharp and unyielding rising inside me. It was not grief. It was not envy. It was something colder, something that promised this envelope was not the end of the story, but the beginning. I left the library with the envelope burning against my chest and headed for the front steps. The foyer smelled like wax and old cigars, a scent that felt as permanent as the marble floor. Gregory's shoes clicked behind me and his hand slid across the banister to block my path as I reached the last step. He told me if I needed work, he could put me on as a warehouse manager. Said it slow, like he was doing me a favor, like he wanted the staff to hear. Samuel laughed from the doorway and asked if the position came with boots thick enough for the puddles in the loading bay. I stepped around them without a word. Outside, the late afternoon had dimmed to a pewter sky. The fountain on the circular drive threw a thin mist into the air that drifted toward the row of cars. Gregory's Maserati idled with a soft growl, slate gray and polished to a mirror. Samuel's Cadillac sat beside it, black paint shining, a valet standing by with a white towel over his arm. My Ford waited near the hedges with a film of road dust on the hood, and a small crack in the windshield I had told myself I would fix when the next job paid out. Gregory strolled alongside me, hands in his pockets, voice pitched low so only I could hear. He said the warehouse needed someone who did not mind taking orders. He said there was dignity in honest work if I could finally bring myself to it. Samuel called across the drive that New York could be generous to a man who knew his place. Victoria and Claire trailed behind, whispering and trying not to smile. Aunt Margaret appeared on the steps and told them to let me be. Her voice was not loud, but it carried. Gregory lifted both hands as if he had been the one wronged and told her I should learn to accept reality. He said the company had to be run by people who understood scale. I told him I understood more than he thought and reached for the driver's side door. He leaned down, palm flat on the roof over my head. He said a lot of things die with a man and some things do not. He said respect was one of those things and that father had made his wishes clear. I looked at his cufflink, catching what little light the sky offered, and said nothing. He finally stepped back, a smirk that looked practiced settling over his mouth. Samuel blew me a kiss like it was all a joke and walked to the Cadillac. I dropped into the seat and shut the door. The cabin smelled like old coffee and cold air. For a moment I just sat, hands on the wheel, watching them in the mirror. Gregory gestured to the valet and the Maserati slid forward. Samuel's car followed the taillights, glowing red through the mist before both cars turned toward the gates. The drive went quiet again, the fountain whispering to itself. My fingers found the envelope and I held it in both hands. The paper was rough, the dust leaving a faint smear on my skin. The flap had been sealed with a thin line of glue, brittle now with age. I ran a nail under it and felt it catch. I stopped and leaned back against the headrest. Across the fountain, the great front doors stood open, the chandelier inside burning like a distant sun. In that light, I saw myself at 6 years old, shoelaces frayed, standing at the threshold of my father's study while he finished a call and waved me away without looking up. I closed my eyes and the image shifted. My mother's kitchen in Queens, sunlight on a formica table, her hands around mine as she helped me write my name. Elaine used to sing under her breath when she stirred a pot, simple songs that meant nothing and everything. I could not remember the words anymore, only the rise and fall of her voice and the soft scrape of a wooden spoon. She left one morning for Long Island and did not come back. They told me it was an accident on the expressway, brake failure, a tragic act of fate. My father stood at the foot of my bed that night and said we would not talk about it again. The envelope felt heavier the longer I held it, like it was pulling something up from the past that had been trapped under years of sunce. I slid my thumb under the flap and lifted until the glue gave with a dry whisper. Inside was a single folded sheet, thick stock, the kind my father used for letters of intent and private notes. There was an indentation at the top where a seal had once been pressed. I unfolded it carefully. There were 2 lines written by hand. The first was a number and a name. Zurich Liberty Bank, and a sequence of digits spaced in pairs and trios that meant nothing to me on their own. 44 space 47 829 space 1163. The second line read simply that my mother knew why. I read it twice, then again, the letters refusing to settle. Zurich, a bank I had only ever associated with the kind of money that lived behind heavy doors and smiled at tax codes. An account number that looked like a coordinate pointing to a place far from Westchester and its marble floors. And then the line that cut through all of it. My mother knew why. Heat rose behind my eyes and I swallowed it down. The wipers stilled on the windshield and a fine mist gathered, softening the lights from the house into halos. I pressed the paper flat against my knee and traced the letters with a fingertip as if touch would pull meaning from the stroke of each letter. I did not know what my father expected me to find, but I knew for the first time that he had not left me a joke. He had left me a key. A rap sounded on the passenger window and I flinched. Victoria stood there in her pale coat hair tucked behind her ears, a smile that thought it was kind curving her mouth. I lowered the window an inch. She said they were heading into the city for dinner and that I should not take Gregory's words too personally. She said men like him grew up carrying expectations on their backs and sometimes did not know another way to speak. She said Claire had found a place in Tribeca with a private room, and that I was welcome if I wanted to feel like family tonight. I told her I had things to take care of. She nodded, eyes sliding to the envelope in my lap, brows lifting a fraction. She said some gifts are exactly what they look like. Then she said she hoped I was well and turned away. I put the paper back in its envelope and held it against the steering wheel. My hands had stopped shaking. A steady calm took its place, the kind that arrives when a decision taps you on the shoulder. I thought about calling Aunt Margaret and asking her to come sit with me. Thought about walking back into the house and handing the envelope to Arthur so he could tell me what it meant. Instead, I turned the key and the engine coughed to life. I did not pull out. I let the car idle and listened to the low hum. Somewhere to my right, a gardener pushed a bin down a gravel path, the wheels crackling softly. A staff door clicked, footsteps crossed the cobblestones, then faded. I breathed in and out and thought about the last time anyone had said my mother's name in this house. I could not remember it. You will know when you open this. My father's uneven script flickered in my head. The words did not sound like the man who had asked me if I needed anything with a voice that had already decided the answer. They sounded like a man who had run out of time and finally realized that silence had its own kind of cruelty. I pulled my phone from my jacket. For a long second I stared at the dark screen. The urge to look up the bank to try to make numbers become answers right there in the driveway was almost unbearable. I set the phone face down on the passenger seat. Not here. Not with the house looming in my rear view like a witness that would twist whatever I found into something small. The gatehouse light blinked as the guard stepped out and looked toward the tree. I raised a hand, and he disappeared back inside. I switched off the engine and let the sudden quiet settle. Then I climbed out, locked the car, and slid the envelope into the inner pocket of my jacket where the fabric held it snug to my ribs. Gregory and Samuel were long gone. The sky was a sheet of dull silver now, the first fine snow of the season starting to mix with the mist. It gathered on my hair and shoulders as I stood on the steps a moment and looked at the dark windows on the second floor. Somewhere up there was the guest room with its neutral art and the closet that still held a winter coat I had left behind years ago. Somewhere behind another door was the office where my father had written that account number and decided to send it to the son who ate at the far end of the table. I went back inside. The foyer felt colder than the air outside. The staff moved silently, clearing glasses from side tables and removing vases of flowers that smelled too sweet. Aunt Margaret waited near the base of the stairs, a small paper cup of tea in her hands. She handed it to me and said the reading was cruel, but it would pass. I told her I was fine. She looked at my face for proof and did not find it, but she let the lie rest. In the guest room, I closed the door and sat by the window. The trees along the drive shivered in the light wind. I took the paper out again and studied the numbers under the lamplight. The digits meant order to someone. To me, they were the shape of a question I should have asked years ago. It was not the money that pressed on my chest, at least not yet. It was the promise that there had been a plan, that someone, my mother, had understood a danger I had been too young to see, and had left breadcrumbs in a language my father had finally chosen to repeat. I folded the paper and put it back into the envelope. Then I slid the envelope beneath the mattress, not because I thought anyone would search my things, but because the act of hiding it steadied me. I washed my face with cold water until the skin stung and my thoughts narrowed. When I turned off the light, the room fell into a gray half-dark, the kind that makes sounds louder and time longer. I lay down without undressing and stared at the ceiling. The house settled around me, wood contracting, pipes ticking faintly, a distant door closing somewhere below. The letters on that page drifted across my mind like they were etched into the dark. Zurich, Liberty Bank, 44 space 47 829 space 1163. Your mother knew why. Sleep did not come. Instead, there was a slow thaw in my chest where anger loosened and something sharper took its place. Curiosity, yes, but also a need that felt older than any grievance. The need to know whether my life had been bent around a truth no one wanted to admit. When the first thin streaks of morning moved across the wall, I sat up. The envelope waited where I had hidden it, and the house was quiet in the way houses are just before the staff wakes and makes the day appear. I put the paper back into my jacket pocket and listened to my own breathing. I knew what I had to do when the sun was up. The state kept records, the city kept records. The past leaves a paper trail even when people try to sweep it away. I stood and looked out at the drive, the frost a pale film on the stone. In a few hours, my brothers would be on the phone with brokers and decorators. They would talk about views and square footage and slips in Sag Harbor while I opened a different door. The thought steadied me. I turned from the window and reached for my keys. The next morning, I left the mansion before most of the staff had stirred. The envelope rested inside my jacket, the edges worn from how many times I had handled it. I drove south toward the city, frost glinting on stone walls along the parkway. My hands were tight on the wheel, my thoughts looping on one single image, my mother's smile from 23 years ago. I stopped at a diner near Queens that had been there since I was a kid. The neon sign flickered in the gray light, and the smell of bacon and burnt coffee wrapped around me as I walked in. A waitress with tired eyes showed me to a booth. I ordered coffee and slid my laptop out. The envelope lay beside it, small and unimpressive, yet heavier than anything I had inherited. The New York State crash report portal was clinical, all drop-downs and fields. I typed my mother's name, the date, the stretch of the Long Island Expressway where she had died. A list of records appeared. My heart raced as I clicked the one that matched. A scanned document filled the screen. The first page was what I had always been told. Wet roads, loss of control, vehicle left the lane. Fatality pronounced at the scene. Cold words stripping blood and heat from a violent wreck. I turned to the second page. Diagrams of a car barrel showing impact notes. Then came the third page, stamped supplemental, the text fainter, as if it had been copied too many times. Brake line appears compromised near rear wheel well. Evidence of clean edge on hydraulic line consistent with tool damage. Recommend further inspection. File referred for escalation. The final line froze me. Case closed due to insufficient evidence. I read the paragraph again. Tool damage. Clean edge. The words glared at me, undeniable. This had not been a simple accident. My coffee had gone cold, but I did not notice. My father had told me we would not discuss it. That had been the end of it. But the file showed someone had tried to push it further until the door slammed shut. At the bottom was a note. Vehicle release coordinated with counsel for Charles Reed. My father had stepped in. His lawyer, Arthur Blake, had put the final seal on it. I leaned back, chest tight. A dull roar filled my ears. All those years, every memory I had of her, every quiet moment where I wondered why. And the answer had been hidden in a line of text buried in state archives. I scrolled further and found a link for related documents. A memo appeared, half its lines blacked out. It mentioned liaison with federal partners on financial crimes. It listed initials Russo E. My mother's name in a place she was never supposed to be. I froze, staring until the letters blurred. She had not been only a secretary at Reed Holdings. She had been working for the FBI undercover. My throat closed as images of her came back sharper, now redefined. Her insistence that I memorize our address, the way she always checked the locks twice, the curtain drawn halfway across the kitchen window. I thought they had been quirks. They were precautions. I pulled the laptop closer, searching again with the case number from the memo. Minutes from a task force meeting appeared. Most names were redacted, but 3 were not. R. Hayes, K. Lerman, E. Russo. My mother had sat in a Manhattan conference room with agents preparing cases on fraud and money laundering. She had walked out of those meetings and come home to help me with homework as if nothing was different. My hands shook as I saved the files to a folder. I backed them up twice, naming the folder with the case number. The waitress refilled my cup. She asked if I needed anything. I said no, though my voice was tight, and she moved away, sensing she had stepped too close to something private. I picked up my phone and called Aunt Margaret. When she answered, I told her what I had found. The silence on the other end was long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then she said she had always felt it, that something was wrong. She said she had tried to ask questions back then, but every door closed. Father had told her to let grief lie before it poisoned her. She said she obeyed because she was afraid, not because she believed him. I asked if she had ever heard anyone talk about my mother as more than a secretary. Her voice wavered. She said once at a family gathering she overheard someone muttering that Elaine played a dangerous game. She chose to forget because remembering made her fear for me. She told me now that forgetting was no longer an option. When we hung up, my eyes burned. It felt like losing my mother again, but this time with the knowledge that her life had been stolen, not simply cut short. I filed a request for the unredacted report through the county portal, knowing it might take weeks. I searched federal archives for her name. A conference roster in Washington listed Russo E. A news clipping described a female agent presenting on shell companies unnamed, but I knew. The silence surrounding her was too deliberate. I sat there until the afternoon dimmed and the booths emptied. Then I packed up, slid the envelope back into my jacket, and walked to the car. I sat behind the wheel, forehead against the steering wheel. I pictured her face, the sweater she wore the last morning I saw her, the way she pressed a finger to her lips and smiled like she carried a secret. Now I knew she had. The drive back to Westchester blurred. Traffic thickened on the bridge and thinned as I reached the stone walls and bare trees near the mansion. Inside the house, lamps had been lit. Music drifted faintly. I climbed the stairs to the guest room and locked the door. On the desk was a hotel notepad. I wrote the account number from memory, then checked it against the paper. I wrote her name and next to it the word FBI. Seeing them together was like hearing glass shatter. I wrote my father's name and then the word silence. The page blurred. I folded it and slid it into the envelope with the account number. I sat on the edge of the bed as the house settled around me, pipes, ticking, doors closing somewhere below. For the first time, the word secretary no longer defined my mother. She had been an agent, a fighter, a woman caught between love and duty, and she had died because of it. I turned off the lamp and lay back in the dark. The envelope rested on the nightstand, its weight anchoring me to the truth. I was no longer the boy who accepted silence at the table. I was a man holding a trail she had left behind, and I was ready to follow it wherever it led. The next morning, I booked a flight to Zurich. I packed lightly, only what I could fit into a worn leather carry-on, the envelope tucked into an inner pocket where I could feel it against my chest. The airport was a blur of gray coats and rolling bags, my thoughts too loud to let the announcements reach me. On the overnight flight, I barely slept, the hum of the engines and the flicker of the cabin lights feeding my restlessness. I stared at the numbers on the page over and over, tracing them in the dim light until the digits seemed to burn into the back of my eyes. Zurich greeted me with a cold drizzle and streets polished by rain. I took a taxi from the airport, the driver humming along to the radio, oblivious to the storm in my chest. The city was beautiful, restrained with its clean lines and quiet elegance. I pressed my hand against the envelope inside my jacket and wondered if my mother had ever walked these same streets, her eyes sharp, carrying secrets no one else could see. The bank was set back from the street, a building of pale stone with tall windows and brass doors that reflected the gray sky. Inside, the air was cool and faintly perfumed with something expensive. A receptionist guided me through layers of security that felt more like crossing thresholds into another world. Finally, I was led into a private office lined with walnut shelves where an older man rose from behind a desk. He introduced himself as Howard Klein. He was 75, tall, though stooped, his hair white, and his eyes the pale blue of mountain ice. His handshake was firm but warm, his voice slow and deliberate. He asked to see my identification and the envelope. I slid both across the desk, my heart pounding. He studied them with the patience of a man who had spent his life weighing truth against forgery. At last he nodded and said my mother's name aloud, as if confirming something with himself. Howard sat back and folded his hands. He said the account had been opened in 1996, deposited with increments through the years, some in cash equivalents, others in transfers from shell entities scattered across different jurisdictions. He said the balance had grown untouched through careful investment. His voice softened as he told me the current value: $127 million. The number landed like a blow. My ears rang, and for a moment I forgot to breathe. I thought of the cracked windshield on my Ford, of the bills stacked on my kitchen counter back in Denver, of the nights I fell asleep, calculating how much time I had before the next paycheck. My chest tightened. This was more than money. This was a fortune buried in secrecy, tied to my mother's last mission. Howard watched me carefully, then leaned forward. He opened a leather folder and slid a stack of keys across the desk. Each key was small, marked with numbers. He said they belonged to deposit boxes in the lower vaults. He explained that my mother had not only placed funds in the account, she had filled those boxes with files. Evidence, he called it. Documents, tapes, photographs, everything she had collected in her work. He paused and let the silence stretch before speaking again. He said she had been tracking transactions routed through Reed Holdings, tracing funds into offshore entities connected to organized crime. She had assembled enough to bury reputations and close doors that had stayed open for decades. He said she must have known it was dangerous, but she kept going until the end. I sat frozen, the room tilting around me. $127 million. Hundreds of files. My mother, who had kissed me goodbye that morning as if she were just going to the office, had been carrying the weight of an empire's secrets. Howard rose slowly and invited me to follow him. We descended into the vaults, each level colder than the one above, the walls thicker, the doors heavier. At the bottom, a guard checked the keys against a ledger. Howard led me to a row of boxes and stopped in front of one marked with a small brass plate. He handed me the key. My fingers shook as I turned it. The door swung open with a metallic sigh. Inside was a stack of files wrapped in twine folders stamped confidential, and a small hard drive encased in plastic. I reached in and lifted the top file. The pages were covered in transfers between shell companies, accounts branching like spider webs. Each page carried names I recognized from business magazines, people my father had shaken hands with at dinners. My skin prickled. Howard rested a hand on my shoulder. He said my mother trusted that one day I would understand. He said the account and the evidence had been waiting for me, shielded until the right moment. He told me I needed to be careful. Possessing this much money and this much proof could make me powerful, but it could also make me a target. I stood there staring at the stack of files, the neat handwriting on the margins that I recognized as hers. For a long moment I could not move. It felt like she was standing beside me, whispering that I had to be strong enough to see it through. Howard told me the bank would continue to safeguard the materials, but he could arrange copies if I wished. I nodded, my voice caught in my throat. He closed the box gently and locked it again, the sound final. As we rose back to the higher floors, I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me. The money was staggering, but it was the files that made my legs tremble. Back in his office, Howard poured water into a glass and slid it across the desk. I drank slowly, the cold liquid grounding me. He said he had known my mother briefly years ago. He said she carried herself with quiet determination, that she never wavered even when the risks were clear. He looked at me for a long time before saying she would have been proud. I pressed my palms flat against the desk, steadying myself. $127 million. Evidence enough to topple the very foundation of Reed Holdings. My brothers had laughed at a dusty envelope. They had no idea it held the power to make them kneel. The rain had stopped when I stepped out of the bank. The streets glistened, the air sharp with the scent of stone and water. I walked slowly, the envelope heavier now, with copies of documents tucked inside. Every sound, every passing face seemed sharper, more dangerous. I paused under the awning of a cafe and looked at my reflection in the glass. I no longer saw the forgotten son who sat at the end of the table. I saw a man holding proof and wealth and a legacy built in silence. I pulled my coat tighter and started walking. The city stretched ahead, calm and orderly, but under it I could feel the tremor of what I carried. My mother's trail had led me here to a fortune and a truth that could not be ignored. I did not yet know where it would take me next, but I knew there was no turning back. When I returned to New York, the air felt different, heavy with knowledge I could no longer ignore. The envelope pressed against my chest as I walked through the terminal, a quiet reminder of what waited inside. The city stretched out in winter gray, and every tower seemed to lean with secrets. I drove to a construction site Reed Holdings had been boasting about in the news, a high-rise in Midtown that was supposed to represent progress. The workers eyed me warily when I stepped onto the muddy lot, hard hats bright against the dull sky. One man in his 50s approached his face, weathered, his hands scarred from years of labor. He introduced himself as a subcontractor, and when I told him my name, his eyes shifted with recognition and caution. He said Gregory had forced them into signing contracts that inflated costs by millions, with threats that they would never work in the city again if they refused. His voice carried bitterness as he explained how materials were swapped for cheaper substitutes while Reed Holdings billed clients for premium steel and imported stone. I asked him why he was telling me this. He glanced around, lowered his voice, and said, "Because someone needed to know, and because Charles Reed had once promised things would be different." He spit into the dirt and said the promise had died with him. I left the site with his words echoing in my head, the image of workers risking their safety while my brother counted profits clawing at me. The next morning, the headlines confirmed what I already suspected. Samuel appeared in glossy photographs smiling beside Claire on the steps of a real estate office in the Hamptons. The article praised his upcoming purchase of a sprawling oceanfront villa, a property worth nearly $12 million. He spoke to reporters about clean investments and the strength of the Reed name. I stared at the photograph until my coffee went cold, his confident grin burning into my vision. I knew the villa would be bought with money scrubbed through false fronts and buried in shell corporations, the same money my mother had traced. Later that day, I called Arthur Blake and asked to meet. He agreed without hesitation, as if he had been waiting for the call. His office smelled of leather and old paper, lined with shelves of legal tomes that had been used to bury more than they had ever revealed. He poured whiskey into 2 glasses, but I left mine untouched. He studied me for a long moment before speaking. He told me that my father had known about the laundering, the fraud, the bribes. Charles Reed had built his empire with one hand shaking investors and the other pocketing money funneled from darker places. Arthur's voice grew heavy when he admitted my father had kept it hidden, not out of ignorance but out of strategy. He said Charles had chosen to leave the evidence with me because he knew my brothers would drown themselves in wealth, but I might understand the difference between inheritance and truth. I asked him if my mother had died because of what she discovered. His eyes flicked down just once, and that was all the answer I needed. He said my father had tried to control the storm, but storms do not bend to anyone's hand. He leaned forward and told me to be careful because now the storm was mine. Walking back into the city night, the streets glistening from melted snow, I felt the ground shifting under me. The files from Zurich, the testimony of a contractor, the headlines of Samuel's purchase and Arthur's confirmation, all wove together into a net too tight to escape. I saw clearly what my brothers had inherited. Their $18 million was not a reward, but the gilded surface of rot, the shiny mask over years of crime and betrayal. I sat in my car outside Reed Plaza, the skyscraper glowing like a beacon against the dark sky. I thought of Gregory inside, speaking in boardrooms, shaking hands, his voice dripping with authority. I thought of Samuel raising champagne in a Hampton villa while workers signed fraudulent contracts. My grip tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. The inheritance they celebrated was nothing more than a poisoned chalice. The empire they paraded was crumbling from within. My father had left me the truth not to comfort me, but to force me to decide what to do with it. As the city pulsed around me, I understood. The dusty envelope had not been a joke. It had been a key. And now the lock was open, showing me everything they had tried to bury. I stepped out of the car and looked up at the tower, its windows reflecting the restless city. For the first time, I felt no trace of envy for my brother's wealth. What I carried was heavier than their millions. It was the weight of proof, of secrets of justice waiting in silence. And I knew the cracks in the Reed empire were widening, ready to split open under the weight of truth. The Reed family gathered that evening in the dining hall of the Westchester estate. The same long oak table that had seen decades of celebrations and disputes stretching out beneath a chandelier that burned too bright. Gregory sat at the head with Victoria at his side, her diamond necklace catching the light. Samuel and Claire claimed the seats to their right, their laughter spilling out like champagne from an overfilled glass. The rest of the extended family filled the chairs along the length of the table. Cousins, uncles, distant relatives drawn by money and the Reed name. Platters of food gleamed under the lights, but the meal was more about show than substance. Gregory raised his glass and spoke of a new development deal downtown, a tower that would outshine every other project in the city. Victoria followed with a story about designers in Milan customizing furniture for their penthouse, her tone dripping with superiority. Samuel boasted about his new villa by the water, the reporters who had written glowing pieces, the parties he planned to host all summer. Claire laughed and added that the new yacht would be ready by spring, larger than anything docked in Sag Harbor. The cousins clapped politely, and the older uncles nodded as if success had always been inevitable. I sat further down near Aunt Margaret. She had always been quieter, her sharp eyes missing nothing. She leaned closer as the noise swelled around us and asked in a low voice what my father had left me. Her question was gentle, almost maternal, but it felt like a stone dropped into still water. I held her gaze and answered softly that he had left me what I needed, nothing more and nothing less. It was the truth, though, not in the way the others would understand. The conversation shifted, laughter growing sharper, the wine flowing freely. Then Samuel stood, his smile wide, holding a folded document. He walked around the table until he reached my chair, laying the paper in front of me with a flourish. He announced loudly enough for the entire room to hear that he wanted to make things easier for everyone. The document, he said, was a waiver. If I signed it, I would officially renounce any claim to Reed Holdings or its assets. He assured the family that it was just a formality, nothing to trouble myself over. All eyes turned to me. The cousins leaned in, whispers running along the table like sparks. Gregory smirked at the head, swirling his glass, clearly pleased with his brother's theater. I looked down at the paper. The text was dense, legal, but the meaning was obvious. They wanted me erased, removed not just in practice but in name. Samuel leaned closer, his grin sharp, and said that it was only right since I had nothing of substance to give up anyway. His words rang across the table, followed by chuckles from some of the relatives. The sting of humiliation pressed against my chest, but beneath it something harder rose, steady and cold. I slid the paper back toward him without touching a pen. My voice was quiet but clear. I told him I would not sign. His grin widened as if my refusal proved his point. He laughed and said that a man with nothing to inherit could not renounce anything. His laughter spread to Gregory and then to others, a chorus of derision that made the chandelier tremble in my vision. My hand went to the inside pocket of my jacket, fingers tightening around the envelope that had never left my side. The paper crinkled under my grip, its weight reminding me of the truth that none of them could see. I lifted my eyes to Gregory first, then to Samuel. For the first time in years, I let them see defiance. My gaze did not drop, did not shift. It held steady and challenging. The laughter faltered for a moment, just enough for silence to slip into the room. The meal continued, the noise ring again, but something had changed. I sat straighter, the envelope pressed against my ribs, their mocking no longer cutting in the same way. They believed they had stripped me of everything, but they were blind to the storm waiting just beyond their reach. When the plates were cleared and the wine replaced with brandy, the cousins lingered in groups, whispering about deals and gossip. Gregory toasted to legacy, Samuel to wealth, Victoria and Claire to a summer on the sea. I sat with Aunt Margaret, her hand covering mine for a brief moment, her eyes searching my face. She said softly that my father had seen something in me no one else had. I squeezed her hand once in answer. As the evening wound down and the family drifted into the grand hall, I rose and slipped out into the cold night air. The stars were sharp above the estate, the fountain whispering at the center of the drive. I stood there, hand in my pocket, gripping the envelope, and replayed Samuel's mocking words in my head. They thought I had nothing. They could not yet see that what I held had the power to unmake everything they claimed as theirs. I turned toward the darkened edge of the estate where the trees swayed in the wind. The cracks were there waiting. I was no longer just the youngest Reed, the forgotten son. I was the keeper of a truth that would not stay hidden forever. The next morning I sat in a cafe near Central Park, trying to steady myself with bitter coffee. That did little to calm the storm inside me. My brother's mocking words from the dinner still rang in my ears, but it was the weight of the envelope that anchored me, pulling me back from despair. As I stared out at the leafless trees, a woman approached my table, her stride purposeful. She introduced herself as Linda Carter, a reporter with the Tribune. She said she had been following the Reed family for years, tracing rumors no one else dared to print. Her eyes were sharp, restless, the kind that missed nothing. She leaned in and told me she knew about Elaine Russo. She said she had a source inside the FBI who had whispered that my mother had not been just a secretary, that she had been a federal agent working deep inside Reed Holdings. My chest tightened as she spoke, confirming what I had only begun to piece together. I asked her why she was telling me this now. She said because someone inside the bureau believed I was the only one who should know the truth, and because the storm was bigger than the family dinner table. Before I could respond, a man entered the cafe, his presence commanding though his clothes were plain. He looked around once, then walked directly to our table. Linda introduced him as Robert Hayes, retired FBI, though he carried himself with the quiet weight of someone who had never truly left the job. His handshake was steady, his eyes heavy with something more than age. He sat across from me and said he had known my mother. His voice was low but certain. He confirmed she had been undercover, assigned to gather proof of laundering through Reed Holdings. He said she had gotten too close, closer than anyone expected, and her death was no accident. My stomach turned cold. I pressed him, demanding to know what he meant. He looked at me long and hard before sliding a folder across the table. My fingers shook as I opened it. Inside were reports, surveillance notes, photographs clipped together, all bearing the Bureau's marks. Then I saw it, a memo detailing an investigation into sabotage of a vehicle. At the bottom, in plain language, it named Gregory Reed and Samuel Reed as having contracted a man to cut the brake lines on Elaine Russo's car. The words blurred the edges of the page, swimming. I gripped the table until my knuckles whitened. Hayes said they had never been prosecuted because the evidence was buried, pushed down by power and influence that reached too far. But the file had survived in a shadow archive, protected by those who still believed in the truth. My breath came shallow, every muscle rigid. My brothers had not just mocked me, they had murdered our mother. Linda watched me closely, her pen idle for once, not writing. Hayes told me my mother had suspected it, had even written in her notes that if anything happened to her, it would not be fate. He said she had left enough breadcrumbs for those who cared to follow. He looked at me as if measuring whether I was one of those people. I could not speak at first. My chest heaved, but no sound came. When words finally broke free, they were hoarse, asking why. Hayes said greed, fear, ambition, a need to protect the empire at all costs. Gregory and Samuel had seen her not as a mother, but as a threat to their inheritance. I sat there frozen, the truth cutting deeper than I imagined possible. I thought back to every cold glance at the dinner table, every time they laughed when I stumbled, every sneer they threw my way. All of it paled before this. They had killed the woman who had given us life. The rage rose hot in my throat, but beneath it was a sorrow so heavy it felt like it would crush me into the floor. Hayes put a hand on the folder and told me to keep it safe. He said the world had a way of swallowing evidence when the guilty had money and reach. He said if I chose to use it, I had to be prepared for war. Linda leaned in, her eyes alive with the story she sensed, but careful not to press. She said some truths needed the right voice to be heard. I nodded, though my body still trembled. I slipped the folder into my bag, the weight of it more suffocating than the millions in Zurich. This was not inheritance. This was damnation written in ink and blood. We parted outside the cafe. Linda promised to stay close to help if I needed the media's light. Hayes clasped my shoulder and said my mother had believed in me even when my father had turned cold. He said she had told him once that her youngest son had a stronger spine than anyone realized. Then he walked away into the crowd, leaving me with the echo of her faith and the crushing truth of her death. I stood on the sidewalk, the city rushing past me. Horns blaring, voices calling, but all of it sounded distant. My hand pressed against the folder inside my coat. My brothers had laughed at me, had called me nothing. But now I carried proof that they were worse than liars. They were killers. For the first time, my fear hardened into resolve. The cracks in the Reed empire were no longer just financial fraud or broken contracts. They were bloodlines cut by greed, and I knew then that the storm was not coming. It was already here. I walked out of the cafe into the cold air with the folder from Hayes pressed under my arm. The city seemed louder than usual, horns sharper, footsteps heavier, as if it knew I was carrying proof that could shatter everything. The storm had already broken. Now it was about how to steer through it. I called Arthur from a payphone on Madison Avenue, not wanting my cell signal traced. He picked up on the second ring, his voice steady and deliberate. When I told him I needed to see him immediately, he said only to come at once. His office looked exactly as it had before, dark walnut shelves, framed degrees, law books stacked with careful order. Arthur poured himself a small measure of whiskey, then folded his hands and waited. I spread the folder across his desk. Zurich bank statements, Shell company trails, Hayes's file naming Gregory and Samuel in the sabotage of my mother's car. He read each page with the patience of someone who had lived through decades of deception. When he finally spoke, his words were blunt. He said the material was explosive enough to destroy reputations, careers, and lives. But it would only matter if we handled it properly. He laid out the plan, one clean package delivered directly into federal hands with a chain of custody that could withstand cross-examination. The rest held back copies, timed to strike when my brothers were at their most arrogant so they could not spin or bury the story. I told him I had already made duplicates, one set secured in Zurich, another on drives hidden where no one would think to look. Arthur nodded approvingly. He reminded me that redundancy was survival when you were up against men who could buy silence. Then he said something I had not expected. Years earlier, my father had placed certain sealed documents into his custody meant only for me. He slid a thin envelope across the desk saying Charles Reed had never explained why. I tucked it into my coat without opening it. I was not ready. From there I met Linda in a small side office of the Tribune. She looked tired, hair tied back, but her eyes burned with the hunger of a reporter who sensed history. I told her I would not hand the files to the press, not yet. The law would have the first strike. But when the time came, I would need light. She leaned forward and promised me she would be ready. She explained how to frame public records requests, how to build a timeline that even hostile lawyers could not rip apart. She offered names of forensic accountants who could untangle the trails of money into language any jury could grasp. I thanked her but said I needed to keep the circle small. She respected that. That night, back in my guest room at the estate, my phone buzzed with an email from a client in the Bronx. It was a developer who had just signed a contract with my Denver firm for structural design work. The message was apologetic but final. He was canceling. He claimed financing issues, but there was a line that betrayed the truth. He had received a call from Gregory, who had warned him I was a liability. My jaw locked so tight it hurt. I called the developer. His voice carried the nervous edge of a man who knew he was betraying someone but had more to lose if he resisted. He confirmed Gregory's interference, then rushed off the line. My hands trembled as I hung up, not with fear but with fury. They were not satisfied with laughing at me. They wanted to erase me completely, even strip away the small company I had built with sweat and long nights in Denver. The next morning, I met Hayes in a rented office near Federal Plaza. The room was bare except for 2 chairs and a file cabinet with a heavy lock. He looked at the files again, then asked what Arthur had said. I repeated the plan. Hayes agreed, saying it was clean and would keep the evidence from vanishing into some basement drawer. He said he had a contact in the Bureau's public corruption unit, someone he trusted. She could take possession of the files, properly document every page, and keep the chain of custody intact. I asked him what would happen after that. His eyes hardened. Once the Bureau had it, the case would move quickly, he said, but it would not be quiet. Phones would ring. Stories would shift. Men like Gregory and Samuel would spend millions to muddy the water. He warned me to prepare for smears, for threats, for doors slamming shut. He asked if I was ready. I told him I had been ready since I saw my mother's name on those task force memos. That afternoon, another call came from Denver. My site manager sounded tense. A school renovation project we had secured in Aurora had pulled out. This time, the client admitted a banker from New York had called, whispering that my company was unstable. He would not give a name, but I did not need one. My brother's fingerprints were all over it. I went back to Arthur's office with the news. He told me to start documenting everything: canceled contracts, calls, names, dates, emails. He drafted a formal cease and desist letter accusing Reed Holdings of tortious interference. He admitted it would not stop them, but it would create a trail, a marker that would matter later. He sent it certified while I watched. Then he reminded me to keep every threat, every scrap of evidence in a separate drive. That evening, Linda called. She said a press release had gone out about a gala in Midtown to celebrate Reed Holdings' new global partnership. Gregory would deliver the keynote speech about legacy. Samuel would host an after-party where he planned to announce the villa purchase. Cameras would be there. Politicians, bankers, society names. She said if I wanted the world to see, that would be the stage. Her voice carried a note of warning, but also anticipation. 2 days later, Hayes arranged a meeting with his contact at the Bureau. It was in a conference room with blank walls and fluorescent lights. She was in her 40s, sharp, methodical. She introduced herself only by first name. She asked pointed questions and made me repeat details twice. Agents came in with cameras and photographed every document, tagging each piece for record. She slid me a card with a private number and told me to call if I felt unsafe. Her voice carried no sympathy, only certainty. It was strangely comforting. When I stepped into the hallway, Hayes was waiting. He told me it had gone as well as it could. He said the Bureau would move, but the noise would be loud. I nodded, though the weight on my chest did not lighten. The next morning, another contract fell. That made 3 in a week. My firm in Denver was bleeding, not because of failure, but because of sabotage. My brothers were reaching across state lines to crush me. The rage that filled me was not wild, but cold, precise. It was no longer only about my mother's death. It was about me. They wanted me broken, erased. I would not give them the satisfaction. That night, I opened my suitcase and pulled out a photograph I had taped inside, a grainy shot of my mother at a holiday party in the 90s, smiling as she held a tray of pastries. I stared at it until my throat ached. Then I took a pen and wrote the names Gregory and Samuel on a sheet of paper, underlined them, and wrote one sentence beneath. This is not about money. This is about ending it. I slept for 4 hours, dreamless. When I woke, dawn was pale over Westchester. I brewed coffee and watched the frost across the lawn. The gala was 3 days away. Gregory would boast about empire. Samuel would toast to his new villa. Cameras would flash and they would believe themselves untouchable. That was when the ground beneath them would shift. I dressed in a dark suit, slid the envelope of curated documents into my inner pocket, and checked the small encrypted drive in my shoe. I placed the bureau card in my wallet and Arthur's sealed letter in my briefcase. I stood for a moment in silence, steadying my breath. The storm was already here. Now it was time to walk into it. The ballroom of the Lexington Grand Hotel glowed with chandeliers that spilled gold across polished marble floors. Laughter, clinking glasses, and the low hum of a string quartet filled the air. It was a spectacle worthy of a coronation, and Gregory and Samuel carried themselves like kings accepting their crowns. Reporters clustered near the velvet ropes, their flashes strobing the stage as if the night itself needed proof. Gregory wore a tailored black tuxedo, his bow tie crisp, his voice booming with false warmth as he welcomed bankers, politicians, and developers. Samuel played the role of charming host, glass of champagne always half full. His arm around Claire, who wore a gown that shimmered like liquid silver. Victoria swept through the crowd in emerald satin, her laughter ringing louder than the violins. They paraded their wealth with every gesture, every word, as if the air itself should bend in gratitude. I stepped into the room quietly, my suit dark and plain, my presence unnoticed at first. The envelope rested against my ribs, hidden beneath the fold of my jacket. I moved along the edge of the crowd, letting their brightness drown me in shadow. No one greeted me. No one even looked my way. To them, I was still the youngest, the forgotten one, the man with nothing to his name. That suited me. The waiters floated through the room with trays of caviar and imported wine. I took a glass only to have something in my hand, the taste sharp and bitter. Gregory was already on stage, boasting about legacy and vision, speaking of the Reed Empire as if it had been built on integrity instead of blood. Samuel nodded along, grinning at every pose as if the applause were meant for him too. Linda moved deftly among the reporters, her camera hidden inside the guise of a press badge. She smiled at Gregory, asked harmless questions about market trends and philanthropy. Her voice honeyed, her eyes sharp. He basked in it, puffed with arrogance, unaware she was framing him against a backdrop of greed and deceit. Her cameraman adjusted the lens, capturing every self-satisfied smirk. I drifted closer to the stage. Conversations swelled around me. Victoria bragged to a group of society wives about a yacht larger than any in Sag Harbor, describing the parties they would host, the guest lists that would exclude anyone who mattered less. Claire boasted about a villa on the water, sunlight pouring through windows wider than most homes. They held court like queens, their words as sharp as their jewelry. Everywhere I turned, the arrogance pressed heavier. Men toasted to partnerships signed in back rooms. Women laughed about estates purchased with funds scrubbed clean of origin. The Reed Empire's rot was hidden under gowns and tuxedos, under chandeliers and champagne, but I could see it in every glance, every careless word. I stood at the edge of the stage steps, the noise rising until it filled my chest. Gregory raised his glass high, thanking investors for their faith, the city for its loyalty, and the Reed family for its unity. His words twisted like a knife, a celebration built on lies and betrayal. I felt the envelope pulse against me, the paper inside carrying a truth louder than any toast. Linda caught my eye across the room. Her camera light blinked once, a signal. She had what she needed. The moment was building, the air tightening as if the walls themselves were waiting. My fingers curled against the fabric of my jacket, brushing the edge of the envelope. The crowd cheered, glasses clinked, and the chandeliers blazed brighter. Gregory's smile widened. Samuel clapped his brother on the back. Victoria and Claire posed for photographs that would run in glossy magazines. The orchestra struck a louder note, the hum of the party rising to its peak. I felt my pulse quicken, steady and fierce. The night had reached its climax. The stage was set, the audience gathered, the masks polished to perfection. And I stood there silent, waiting, knowing the moment I carried was close. The orchestra swelled and the room shimmered with light when the first crack of authority cut through the glamour. A commanding voice echoed from the entrance. "Federal Bureau of Investigation, everyone remain where you are." The music stopped mid-note, glasses froze in mid-air, and a hush swept over the ballroom before panic rushed in. Agents in dark suits poured through the doors, moving with precision, their badges flashing against the gold light. Robert Hayes walked at the front, his shoulders square, his eyes locked on the stage. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the party transformed into a crime scene. Gregory faltered, his smile cracking for the first time all night. Samuel raised his hands, trying to laugh it off, saying this had to be a mistake, that Reed Holdings had always cooperated with authorities. But the agents closed in and the laughter died in his throat. The clinking of silver cuffs snapping shut on their wrists rang louder than the violins ever had. Cameras that had been pointed at gowns and champagne now swiveled, flashes exploding like lightning. Reporters shouted questions over the chaos. Gregory's face twisted as agents pulled his arms behind his back, his polished shoes slipping against the marble floor. Samuel cursed, shouting that they would regret this, that the Reed name could not be dragged through the mud. His voice cracked when the second cuff locked. The guests surged back, dresses rustling, chairs toppling, the glittering elite of Manhattan reduced to frightened spectators. Victoria clutched her necklace with trembling hands, her eyes darting between her husband and the cameras. Claire wept openly, mascara streaking her cheeks. No one stepped forward to defend them. No one dared. Gregory caught sight of me near the edge of the stage. His face shifted from fury to desperation. He shook his head violently, calling my name, begging me to intervene. Samuel dropped to his knees when the agents pressed him forward. His voice hoarse, pleading with me to help him, to remember we were brothers. The chandelier lights struck their faces not as victors but as men undone. I slipped my hand into my jacket and pulled out the envelope that had followed me through every dark turn. The room seemed to still as I unfolded the paper, the same creased page my father had left for me. My voice did not need to rise. The cameras caught every word. Character decides worth. Let them receive what they deserve. Hayes's eyes met mine across the chaos. He gave a single nod as if to confirm that the choice was mine to make. I folded the paper again and held it tight. Gregory cried out that this was not justice, that deals had been made, that secrets should have stayed buried. Samuel's voice broke entirely, promising anything if I would just speak on their behalf. But the weight of their betrayal crushed every trace of pity in me. Flashes erupted faster as reporters shouted to their feeds. One voice carried over the frenzy: Reed Holdings' empire collapses in a single night. The words struck like a gavel, carried instantly across the city and beyond. The ballroom, once their throne, had become their prison. The agents pulled Gregory and Samuel toward the entrance, their heads bowed, their wrists chained. Their shoes scraped against the marble, their pleas trailing behind them like smoke. Guests whispered in disbelief, their gowns and tuxedos now costumes for an audience that had just witnessed the fall of giants. I stood rooted to the floor, the envelope in my hand. My father's words burning into my palm. For the first time in years, I felt taller, not because of wealth or power, but because the truth had finally spoken louder than their lies. The chandeliers glittered above, but the room felt darker, stripped of illusion. And in that darkness, justice had finally found its place. The morning after the gala, I packed a single suitcase and checked out of the Lexington Grand before the city was fully awake. New York felt quieter, stripped of its usual rhythm, as if the empire my brothers had built had always been the beat that drove it. I hailed a cab to LaGuardia, staring out the window as the skyline receded. For the first time in years, I felt no weight pressing me down. When the plane touched down in Denver, the air was thinner, cleaner, sharper against my lungs. I drove straight to my office, the small brick building with a weathered sin that still bore my company's name. The parking lot was half empty from the contracts Gregory had poisoned, but walking inside felt different now. The betrayal that had haunted every step had been dragged into daylight. I had a choice again. I met with my team in the conference room, their faces tense with worry about the future. I told them the truth. I had funds $10 million that I would invest to secure the company's future, to win back contracts not through intimidation, but through hard work. Their eyes widened, not at the number, but at the fact that we had survived. For the first time, hope replaced fear in their expressions. Later that week, I drove to a lawyer's office downtown and signed the papers for a foundation in my mother's name. The Elaine Russo Fund would provide support for children who had lost parents to violence. The thought of her name etched on the letterhead brought a heat behind my eyes I could not hold back. She had lived in the shadows, sacrificed everything, and now her name would stand for light. I kept the rest of the Zurich account untouched, $127 million sitting silent in a vault half a world away. It was not mine to spend. It was proof, it was testimony, and it was a reminder of what greed had done to my family. Leaving it where it was felt like the only way to honor her. Aunt Margaret came to Denver not long after. She embraced me in the doorway of my home, her voice trembling as she whispered that I had given my mother's honor back. Her words settled into me deeper than any applause or headline ever could. Nights were different now. I no longer heard my brother's voices mocking me in silence. I no longer felt the sting of being the forgotten son at the end of the table. I carried only the sound of my father's letter in my chest. Character decides worth. I had once believed I was left with nothing more than a dusty envelope. But inside it had been justice, truth, and the freedom to finally live on my own terms. So let me ask you this. If it were you and you held a fortune that could buy anything, would you take it all for yourself, or would you choose the path of character instead? If you found value in this story, remember to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss the next journey into family betrayal and justice.